Ever get totally hooked by a story?
Right.
Like one that just sticks with you, even makes you rethink things a little. Well, we're taking a deep dive into one of those today, Michelle remembers. Back in the 80s, this book. Oh, it really creeped people out.
Yeah, it really captured the public's imagination, didn't it? What makes this case so fascinating is how a seemingly normal therapy session kind of blew up into this massive cultural phenomenon Michelle remembers, was presented as like this totally true story about repressed memories. And it became a huge part of that whole satanic panic thing that gripped North America.
And for this deep dive, we've got some pretty interesting sources to work with. We've got Michelle's own words, as documented by her therapist, this Dr. Lawrence Pazder. And we've also got snippets from a recent book club podcast that, like, totally dissects the whole thing. It's kind of like we're eavesdropping on the therapy sessions themselves, right? Plus, we get a glimpse of what was going on in society that allowed this story to take hold and spread.
It's a really unique perspective, yeah. These sources let us examine not just what happened, but also like the whole idea of memory. How powerful it can be, how belief works, and even the anxieties that can shape how we see the world.
Okay, so let's rewind the clock back to 1973. Michelle, she's 27 years old, walks into Dr. Pazder's office. She's had a pretty tough life, actually. Parents who really, really wanted a boy. Her mom dying when she was just 14, a dad who wasn't around much, plus she went to Catholic boarding school even though she wasn't Catholic. And then on top of all that, she'd just had a miscarriage.
Yeah, all that loss, all that grief that she hadn't really dealt with, it's crucial to understanding where she was emotionally when she started therapy. She was carrying a lot of baggage, so to speak.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
She's already in a fragile state when she tells Dr. Pazder, a psychiatrist, by the way, about this super vivid dream she had. He gets this idea that maybe she's got repressed memories. And, well, he suggests using hypnosis to unlock her past.
Ooh, that's where things get really interesting. Hypnosis is a legit therapy tool, don't get me wrong, but it can be tricky, you know? You're messing with the subconscious, which is super susceptible to suggestion.
So, under hypnosis, Michelle starts sharing these, like, fragmented memories of a shadowy figure named Malachi, who keeps telling her to go northwest.
And Dr. Pazder, he grabs onto these little pieces like they're clues to some huge buried trauma.
And as they keep doing these sessions, Michelle starts regressing. Like, she's talking and acting like a 5-year-old. And she describes these increasingly disturbing rituals. She talks about being held captive, forced to take part in these ceremonies, even seeing animal sacrifices and dead babies.
Chilling stuff, yeah. But what's even more unsettling is how Dr. Pazder reacts. He just accepts these increasingly bizarre memories without question, like they're facts. He's writing it all down meticulously.
That lack of, like, critical thinking from the therapist, that's a huge red flag, right? Makes you wonder if his own beliefs maybe steered the whole therapy in a certain direction.
Oh, absolutely. His acceptance basically validated everything Michelle was saying, creating this feedback loop that could have, made her memories stronger, whether they were accurate or not.
He became a believer, not a neutral observer. And then there's how he acted during the sessions, which the sources say was, well, ethically questionable. He moves his chair closer to her, holds her hand, even lets her rest her head on his shoulder. It all sounds a bit too close for comfort, don't you think? In a therapist-patient relationship, I mean.
It's a major breach of boundaries, for sure. For a few reasons, actually. First, it goes against the whole point of having professional distance in therapy. And second, it might have made Michelle emotionally dependent on him, further entangling her with her therapist.
And it doesn't stop there. Michelle's memories, they get even crazier. She describes being trapped in a grave full of dead kittens, forced to drink some weird concoction. And she even says she saw a ritualistic birth. It's like each revelation is more disturbing than the last.
Yeah, it raises a question, doesn't it? Could all this escalating craziness be because of, like, Dr. Pazder asking leading questions, or Michelle's subconscious trying to give him what she thinks he wants? Like we talked about before, the mind is super suggestible under hypnosis.
It's like her imagination is running wild, fueled by suggestion and maybe a desire to please. But there's this other layer to the story that makes it even weirder. There's zero hard evidence to back up any of her claims.
Right. Even though she describes these awful tortures, like horns and a tail being sewn onto her, there aren't any scars. The locations are vague, she doesn't name names, and whenever there's a gap in her memory, there's always a convenient explanation for it.
Like that time she says she escaped a burning car wreck without a single scratch. A little too convenient, isn't it?
It does make you wonder about how accurate these memories really are. But we have to remember what was going on back then. It was the 70s. Repressed memory therapy was becoming a big thing. People were fascinated by the occult thanks to stuff like Sybil and The Exorcist. And there was this growing anxiety about daycare, moms working, and all these societal changes happening.
So are you saying that even though Michelle's story was pretty far out there, it somehow tapped into the fears of that time?
Exactly. What she was claiming, as wild as it was, played on existing fears about like these secret satanic cults preying on kids, fears that the media was only making worse at the time.
The sources mention this super sensational article in a local paper called The Victorian. It talked about satanic cults operating in Victoria, and it's basically a blueprint for the panic that followed. It's like it echoes a lot of the themes of Michelle's story.
And that media coverage, often based on like zero evidence, just threw more fuel on the fire. It shaped how the public saw things and created this environment where people were ready to believe the unbelievable.
Yeah, it's kind of scary how one story, mixed in with all those societal fears, can really change how people think.
Last time we were talking about how Michelle Remembers just blew up, right? Got all that media attention and Dr. Pazder pushing it out there.
Right. And the deeper we go into Michelle's memories, the worse it gets. I mean, she starts talking about being tortured, branded, burned. She even says they put a cage full of snakes on her.
Oh, man. That's straight out of a horror movie.
Yeah.
But even when she's describing all this awful stuff, there are no specifics, you know?
Like, yeah, she talks about the snake cage in detail, but she can't remember how they put it on her or how she got out. That's something we see a lot with confabulation, when you've got these vivid sensory details, but like zero context.
Confabulation, what's that exactly?
Oh, it's a psychological thing where people, without even realizing it, fill in the gaps in their memory. It's not like they're lying, but they kind of make stuff up.
Yeah.
These details can be influenced by things other people say to them, which ends up distorting the real memory.
So Michelle might have actually believed all this, even if it didn't really happen. Totally. It's important to remember that the brain, especially when it comes to trauma, can be pretty creative in how it deals with things, how it makes sense of experiences. Confabulation could be a way of putting those fragmented memories back together, or coping with emotional pain.
That makes sense. And, another thing I noticed is how much guilt and shame Michelle expresses throughout these memories.
Yeah.
She's constantly asking Dr. Pazder to believe her that she didn't want to do any of it.
Right. That guilt, along with the increasingly horrible stuff she's remembering, makes you think maybe she was dealing with some really deep internalized shame. Maybe she was blaming herself for things, events, or feelings she couldn't really express directly.
I wonder if these, outlandish satanic memories were her way of expressing that inner turmoil in a way that people would actually pay attention to, especially back then when people didn't really talk openly about personal struggles like that.
That's a really interesting idea. It fits with the idea that Michelle's memories, even if they weren't totally factual, were her way of showing her trauma and pain in a symbolic way. The satanic stuff, as messed up as it is, gave her a way to communicate her suffering.
It's kind of sad, isn't it? She was trying to find a way to express her pain, but her story ended up creating all this fear and false accusations. The sources say that Dr. Pazder started telling his colleagues about Michelle's case. He even presented it at some conferences.
And that's where the snowball effect started happening. He presented her story as proof that satanic ritual abuse was real, and it kind of planted the seed for other people to see their own experiences or anxieties in the same light.
So Michelle's story, amplified by Dr. Pazder, became a model for other people to understand, or maybe misunderstand, their own lives.
Exactly. And this is where their relationship takes a major turn. As Michelle's therapy goes on, Dr. Pazder gets more and more emotionally invested. He ends up leaving his wife and family.
Even though the book tries to downplay it, it's pretty clear that Dr. Pazder's focus on Michelle was raising eyebrows, right? The sources suggest he was so caught up in the drama of her recovery that he completely forgot about those ethical boundaries you need in a therapist-patient relationship.
It's what happens when a therapist gets too close, too involved. The power dynamic in that relationship can get really messed up when those boundaries are blurred. And that can be dangerous for the patient.
And the consequences of that, well, they went way beyond Michelle's case, didn't they?
Oh, absolutely. As Dr. Pazder became more and more convinced that Michelle was telling the truth, he went from being her therapist to being like her biggest supporter. He started pushing Michelle Remembers as this warning, a wake-up call about the dangers hidden in society.
And because he was a psychiatrist, people believed him, right? It gave Michelle's claims more weight than they would have had otherwise. And then, of course, the media got involved. Once Michelle Remembers was published, it was like a bomb went off.
The media loved it, ate it up. The public was fascinated by the occult, and this story was pure sensationalism. Talk shows, news, magazines, everyone wanted a piece of Michelle and Dr. Pazder.
It's like the book, the way it was written, all dramatic like a thriller, was made for the media. And that blurred the lines between fact and fiction even more.
Right. And like we talked about before, all those inconsistencies in Michelle's memories, the fact that there was no real evidence, that was all just ignored or brushed aside by the media.
It's crazy how much power the media has to shape what people believe, especially when a story plays on their fears and anxieties. The media just accepting Michelle's story without question, combined with Dr. Pazder pushing it so hard, well, that had some pretty serious consequences for society.
It did. It created this environment of fear and suspicion that really affected people's lives. We'll talk more about those consequences in the last part of our deep dive.
It's wild, right? How a story that starts with personal struggles can turn into something so big, so impactful. We talked about how Michelle Remembers basically went viral, fueled by all the media attention and Dr. Pazder pushing it.
Yeah, and the effects went way beyond just Michelle. It was like a ripple effect that spread all over North America.
The sources talk about all these false accusations that popped up after the book came out.
Michelle's story became so well known that people, sometimes with therapists who really meant well but were kind of misguided, started thinking their own problems were caused by repressed memories of satanic abuse.
It's just awful to think about the damage that caused. There were even stories in the sources about people who later admitted they made the accusations up, or that their memories were, like, implanted by therapists who use suggestive techniques.
It's a reminder that memory, especially when it comes to trauma, isn't always reliable. Memories aren't like perfect recordings, you know? They're more like reconstructions that can be changed by all sorts of things. Suggestions, imagination, even how we're feeling at the time.
So even a therapist with the best intentions could accidentally make a patient believe something that never happened.
Exactly. The therapist has so much power in that relationship. And when someone's looking for help, they're vulnerable. It creates this situation where manipulation can happen, even if the therapist truly believes they're uncovering the truth.
It really makes you think about how important critical thinking is in therapy, and how important ethics are, especially when you're dealing with something as sensitive as repressed memories.
And it wasn't just individual cases Michelle Remembers made people distrust institutions, especially those involved with kids, like daycare centers and schools.
Parents got super anxious. They were watching every little interaction, seeing signs of satanic panic everywhere.
That suspicion really hurt communities. Trust broke down, and everyone was scared. Daycare workers, teachers, even family members were accused of things with barely any evidence, and just a lot of emotional accusations.
It's a pretty dark part of our history. Shows what can happen when a personal story gets mistaken for the absolute truth.
The satanic panic is definitely a cautionary tale. We have to be careful about believing everything we hear, especially when it's about trauma and memory.
We can't just accept information blindly. We have to think critically, check our sources, look for other explanations, and remember that everyone has biases.
And probably the most important thing is that we push for ethical and responsible therapy, practices that treat people with respect and sensitivity, and that use approaches based on evidence, not just speculation.
Our deep dive into Michelle Remembers has been a real eye-opener, hasn't it? It shows how memory, belief, and storytelling all come together in this fascinating but kind of scary way.
Yeah, it makes you question your assumptions, be more careful about what you believe, and fight for a world where truth and justice are the most important things.
This case shows us that to really understand how people think and feel, you need both empathy and a critical mind. Thanks for coming along with us on this journey. It's been all about memory, stories, and how powerful belief can be. We hope you've got some food for thought as you go out there and navigate this crazy thing we call life.